Good morning, everybody. I'm sorry I'm not there today. My pup is at the vet after being up throwing up all night, girl. So I am doing this before I take her in. Um, for today, just please get this done. If you didn't finish the Watergate one, make sure you do that too. And then I will check both of these when I see you on Tuesday and Wednesday. If we already got this far in the lecture, just skip until we get to the couple slides that we need to. For whatever class that you're in. All right, so once Nixon gets elected, he immediately is going to kind of start putting his plans into action with the plan of Vietnamization. Now, he had campaigned on this idea of peace with honor, right? And so when he gets into office, that's one of the first things that he's going to start to do is try to decrease our involvement in Vietnam. Now, a lot of this is based around, his new sort of stated foreign policy, which is the Nixon Doctrine, right? And if we can remember back to some of the other doctrines we had the Monroe Doctrine, which, if you can remember, talked about how America would consider any European involvement in the Western Hemisphere as a sort of direct attack of colonization and a threat of colonization. The Roosevelt Corollary will be at in the early 1900s when Theodore Roosevelt was president, and that basically says, actually, we're the world's police force. We can go get involved anywhere that we want if we want to. And then in the aftermath of World War II, we had the Truman Doctrine, which said that we can and we should intervene in places throughout the world in order to help support them and prevent, instability and threats to democracy through either external threats or internal rebellions, which of course basically is talking about communism, which of course we use to sort of justify getting involved in both Korea and Vietnam. But the Nixon Doctrine is going to kind of scale that back. So he says that U.S. allies should assume more responsibility for their own defense, and the U.S. would try to avoid involvement in revolutionary wars as a whole. So essentially, the South Koreans should take over more of a role, and we should diminish ours. And so with this, we put in place Vietnamization. And Vietnamization is the idea of gradually replacing U.S. troops by well-trained Southern Vietnamese troops. And in particular, right, remember that year that he's elected, 1968, we have 16,899 U.S. troops killed and over $30 billion spent, which is crazy. So people are very ready to kind of decrease our involvement. Now, Vietnamization is incredibly successful at decreasing the amount of American deaths, but it's not necessarily successful in decreasing casualties as a whole, if that makes sense. So because there's less Americans there are going to be less Americans being killed. Whereas the Southern Vietnamese are also going to continue to have very high casualties. Now, this also is incredibly popular, right? If you notice there on the bottom, by June of 1969, so he's inaugurated in January of 1969, and by June, he has already declared the first withdrawal of combat troops. Over 25,000 troops are withdrawn as soon as he takes office. In March of 1970, so the following year, he plans to remove an additional 150,000 troops. But, that being said, the following month he also expands the war, without really talking to the American public about it, by invading Cambodia. So even though he is showing that we are backing down and we are decreasing the amount of time that we're spending in Vietnam, and the amount of people that we have in Vietnam, he's also expanding the war into Cambodia, which of course is right here, and then ultimately also Laos. Now, part of why he does this is because the Viet Cong had been using Laos and Cambodia for supply routes. But these are still sovereign countries who there's no reason why we should be involved in them. We're going to increase the amount of bombing that we do and increase United States troops' involvement. So the American population doesn't really know about this, which is, a little problematic there. All right. So as we're continuing to see, the war, we're decreasing the number of troops, but we're still involved, and that's really frustrating for a lot of people. And the longer the war drags on, the more the anti-war movement is going to heat up. So this brings us to Kent State. Kent State is in Ohio, and we had seen a lot of protests on the campus, and several thousand students had clashed with police. And ultimately, the students will end up burning an ROTC building. Now, for those of you who don't know what ROTC is, it stands for the Reserve Officers Training Corps, which is a high school and college-based program for training commissioned officers of the United States Armed Forces. So if you want to go into a career in the military, you can do ROTC, which is, a great way to help with that. They also offer a lot of scholarships to help get people to go to college and go through college, and you can enter at sort of a higher level with more training as you head in. So they burned down an ROTC building, and this is sort of one of these controversial moments of like, the protests feel very legitimate in a lot of ways, particularly for all of these students of wanting to get us out and get us out quickly. But at the same time, once you cross over that line from peacefully protesting to destroying property, that right is no longer covered in the same way. You have the right to peaceably assemble, but you do not necessarily have the right to destroy property. And again, that's sort of this, what we were talking about before, with a lot of the protests really, maybe having very legitimate causes or meaning very well, but not necessarily being executed in the most effective manner. Because burning down a ROTC building is not going to make people very sympathetic to your causes. We'll see. So ultimately, the building is burned down. The school actually calls in the National Guard to kind of quell the protesters. But despite that, we still see protesters gather, about 500 of them, and we see some rocks and bottles thrown. But ultimately, the National Guard will fire into the crowd without warning. No disperse and we will shoot. They fire into the crowd, killing 4 students and wounding 9. And so this is huge, again, this is one of those moments of like, lots of people say, well, this idea of government using force against its own civilians, that's absurd, that's so silly, why would anyone ever need protection? But, we see this in a lot of different ways. And I also think this is another interesting moment, very similarly to the Black Panthers, where it's like the modern day roles of the right and left, or there's elements of reversal there, which is interesting. But yeah, this is huge. I mean, this spreads everywhere. People all across the country really feel this one. And interestingly, too, you also see this is massively evidence of a huge divide, right? You have a good chunk of the nation who actually feels very supportive of the actions of the National Guards. And then you have a huge chunk of the population who is appalled of, how this happened and what happened. So evidence of that divide between the sort of rising anti-government sentiment and the increased sort of like what is going on with these students, and they don't know what they're doing, and that's there too. In the aftermath of this, there will be a huge number of campuses who call for Nixon's impeachment, and even more who go on strike. Several colleges actually just burn or close down their campuses for the rest of the year. Not burn down, close down their campuses because they're too worried about violence. 16 other states ultimately have to call out the National Guard as well in reaction to this. All right. Next up, we have a very important event take place, and this is the release of the Pentagon Papers in June of 1971. So, back in 1967, so when we were first, we're a couple years into Vietnam and we had been escalating, the Secretary of Defense, named McNamara, orchestrated or ordered a commission to have 40 researchers examine how and why the United States had become involved in the Vietnam War in the first place. This was supposed to be a top secret report, but one of the researchers, kind of appalled by what he saw, he copied the documents, but sat on them. He was still, very unsure about whether or not this would be a betrayal of the United States, about what he should do with them, but he was just so shocked about what he had seen that he decided to copy them anyway. And finally, by 1971, he's like, okay, I got to do this. I can't sit on this anymore. So he delivers copies of them to the New York Times and to the Washington Post. The documents reveal covert operations and a war kept secret from the American public. So it shows that not only had elected officials known later that things weren't exactly as it seemed, they knew and blatantly lied to the American public about why we went to war in the first place and how bad the war was and what progress we were making and all of that. So this really ends any lingering doubts that the public has about the legitimacy of this war, and we're going to see a huge reversal of support. Before we talked about this with the Tet Offensive as being a huge turning point. The Pentagon Papers kind of sealed the deal. After the Pentagon Papers come out, we consider the war a mistake and we want to get out. And so this is really going to push Nixon to disengage. As you can see there, right, about 15% of people wanted the war to continue after the Pentagon Papers. That's only 15%. 60% considered involvement immoral and 70% considered the war a mistake and favored withdrawal. All right. As a result, we're starting to see, sort of this big push and move away from political involvement. I don't think you have this slide, but just take notes somewhere. We see more and more young people turning away from political involvement, more people across the board feeling like their, opinion doesn't matter. And keep in mind, right, there's all of this whole decade plus has been so tense and so huge, and so feeling like the, government didn't listen to a thing that you had to say and had lied about the whole thing, it feels pointless to be involved. So this is the beginning of the end of political engagement for a little while, and really turns the public as a whole kind of off of politics and away from this, which is also why we're going to see the rise of conservatism and the rise of the 80s. So just like, as you go through this, a lot of how I want you to look at this too is like, okay, well, what way, like, how might this influence this big change that we're going to see as we talk about the 80s this week? People are frustrated and over it, and so, people want to return to stability, and these are all things that you could point to if you were ever to write an essay about that, for example. Okay, so let's finish up here in Vietnam. Okay, so, oops, wrong slide. There we go. All right, so the troops who are over in Vietnam are going to feel increasingly isolated as we move through this. By spring of 1972, the United States begin talks with Vietnam to withdraw American troops in exchange for POWs to be released. Now, we didn't talk a whole lot about POWs this round, but I would highly encourage you to go, look up some footage or interviews. Even hearing John McCain talk about his experiences, right? He was a POW for 5 years. It was brutal. Like we've talked about before in other wars, it's not a good experience. So as we're sort of winding down, these soldiers are feeling increasingly isolated. In many cases, entire units refused to go out on combat patrol, disobeying direct orders. Sometimes soldiers would take out their frustration and resentment on officers who put their lives at risk, or officers who they deemed to be incompetent or overzealous. We see an increase in incidents in which soldiers are AWOL, absent without leave. And we also see drug use increasing. Now, a lot of this, too, is because they feel like the American public isn't supporting them. Right? From all sides, it feels like America has checked out from the war and thinks that everything that they're doing is wrong. And so there's really this feeling of isolation. Again, we start to see an increase in drug use too, like we talked about. A lot of soldiers wind up using heroin heavily in Vietnam. There had actually been a lot of marijuana use until the army cracked down, and then when they did, we see an increase in heroin use. Now, luckily, as soldiers return home from the war, we do actually see a decrease in the amount of heroin use. A lot of soldiers have sort of left that addiction in Vietnam and were able to transition out of it by coming back home, right? They were no longer in that situation. They no longer needed to rely on it as heavily. And so we actually see far fewer soldiers return home addicted than we were anticipating. But that being said, we're still going to see much higher rates of addiction among veterans than we will among the average population because of what they dealt with in Vietnam. So we start negotiations in order to end this war, and we propose a ceasefire in 1972, but people are a little hesitant about that. And so ultimately we're going to see a wave of bombings called the Christmas bombings in December and January of 1972, 1973, in which we actually drop more bombs over the north than in the previous 2 years combined. So huge amount of bombing going on there. Now, ultimately, we will accept that ceasefire on January 27th of 1973, and Americans will exit Vietnam. Now, to be clear about this, the North Vietnamese absolutely wanted us out, but the South Vietnamese did not, right? With the Americans leaving, the idea that they were going to be able to withstand the onslaught of North Vietnam was sort of a little bit unrealistic, is a nice way of putting it. And so they feel, like, well, if the U.S. gets out of this now, we're all screwed. They're all going to come take us over, and we're in a lot of trouble, and we can't deal with that. And so we will see a lot of hesitancy from the South Vietnamese of wanting to leave. Now, that being said, too, we also will take a lot of refugees, but South Vietnam is left incredibly vulnerable as American troops start to come out. So the last sort of like official wave of American troops leaves in 1973. However, we do still have like military advisors and some troops stationed in Saigon in particular in South Vietnam through 1975. On April 29th of 1975, we have the last sort of major wave of evacuations. In 18 hours, over 1,000 American civilians and over 7,000 Southern Vietnamese refugees will be airlifted out of Vietnam. So that was actually yesterday in 1975. And then, so as they're flown out of Saigon, the last people to remain will be U.S. Marines and people leaving the U.S. Embassy into the early morning of April 30th of 1975, so today. And that actually is where we're going to see the last two casualties of, or immediate casualties of the Vietnam War. 2 U.S. Marines are killed in a rocket attack at Saigon at 4:03 in the morning as they were guarding the U.S. Embassy and lifting off. So South Vietnam will be overrun by the Viet Cong. Saigon is surrounded, and then on April 30th, again today, tanks will enter the city of Saigon. The U.S. Embassy will be ransacked, and the war is over. In terms of the aftermath of the war, not only is this going to be incredibly difficult for the American public and American soldiers to try to figure out how to, come back from war and make sense of this whole thing and figure out, whether it was, a good thing or whether it was pointless or how to feel about such a divisive war. We also do a lot of damage to the country of Vietnam with huge numbers of civilian casualties and destruction due to things like Agent Orange and napalm, as well as the bombings. Overall, we dropped 3 times as many tons of bombs in Vietnam as against all of our enemies throughout all of World War II. That's about 268 pounds of explosives per person residing in Vietnam. By the end of the war, about 58,220 Americans are killed and over 300,000 are wounded. For the Vietnamese, about 4 million Vietnamese civilians and another million Cambodians and Laotians are killed throughout this war, so the number is closer to 5 million. And for veterans returning home, about 1 in 6 veterans will either suffer from PTSD or some form of substance abuse or both. And vets really feel like no one is their friend post-war. And this isn't across the board, right? Obviously, this is nuanced, but for some groups of veterans, there's definitely a feeling like, the left dislikes them for killing at all, and the right dislikes them for not killing enough. And I just mean that in terms of, like, the right thought they should have fought harder to win, and the left is like, you're all baby killers and horrible. And so there's a lot of tension. Now, that being said, too, obviously people who are coming home and returning to supporting families and who are there are going to feel a lot better about this. But in terms of just like the general American population, it's not like after World War II. It's not like this massive celebration and all of the troops being lauded as heroes. We don't see that. And that's really difficult, particularly when you're dealing with things like PTSD. We'd also used, remember, Agent Orange and napalm over all of the forests to deforest them. We'd also dropped some of this on our own soldiers, and so we will see Agent Orange seep into the groundwater in some cases and cause some long-term effects like cancer and lung disease and birth defects on civilians. So it really takes a toll. Furthermore, the VA, the Department of Veteran Affairs, will estimate that about 20,000 Vietnam veterans will commit suicide in the aftermath of the war. And we have higher rates of unemployment, prison incarceration, and drug use among Vietnam veterans than among the American population. So this really has a big impact on how we deal with this. Now we move forward. Okay, so moving on to finish this up, we're going to move into talking about the women's rights movement and the gay and lesbian liberation movement. So as we head out of the 1960s and into the 1970s, we're also going to see the rise of, protests beginning, and this is ultimately what we're going to call second wave feminism, which is the feminism of the 1960s and 70s. First wave feminism we generally refer to as the suffrage movement, right? So that's sort of the push to get the women the right to vote. But we're going to see this here too. So again, we're coming out of the 1950s with all of that awesome conformity and all of that loveliness, right? So a lot of people will be talking about in the women's lib movement sort of this housewife syndrome or feeling stifled or trapped. Betty Friedan will come out with the feminine mystique, which is a big critique of this problem. We've begin to see a growing discrepancy with what we see between popular images of women as full-time housewives and mothers and the actual realities of a lot of women's lives, right? Many women aren't doing any of that and have to work or feel looked down on or feel totally trapped in whatever they're in. Now, something I want to say really before we get into this is a lot of the very fair criticisms of second wave feminism center around the fact, too, that this is an incredibly whitewashed movement. Most of the issues that we're talking about are for middle-class white women. So this doesn't take into account a whole lot of what it's like for anyone who's poor to be, of what they're dealing with. So most of the issues that they're discussing are just, we're all stuck at home, we don't have the ability to do anything. And while it's a really important wave of feminism and an important thing to talk about and raise awareness with, it also definitely will be, you see a lot of class divides and a lot of racial divides of not really taking on any issues that women of color are dealing with, or taking on any issues that women who are maybe in a lower socioeconomic status are dealing with. So it's definitely a pretty singular movement. And like any movement, we will see it radicalized too, which is where a lot of the pushback to this idea of feminism as a whole comes in, of just everyone hates men and all that stuff, which is, obviously there are a few people in every movement who sort of make that movement extreme and give the whole movement maybe not the best name, but that's where I think a lot of that pushback to feminism today comes from, is you're all man haters. And yeah, so we'll talk about that. So we will see in September of 1968 one of the first sort of public shows or demonstrations in which there's a protest at the Miss America pageant. After this, we start to see people refer to this as the women's liberation movement. We will also see the development of an organization called NOW, or the National Organization of Women, and they are founded in response to a lot of the growing problems across the board. They seek equal opportunities for women and looked into ending stereotypes about women being incapable of doing anything. They want a truly equal partnership with men, and that will kind of define modern feminism. So again, this is not about advocating for getting rid of men. This is not about advocating for being better than men. It's just sort of hey, we would like to be treated the same. We'd like to have the same opportunities. So from there, we have to still work hard and work for ourselves, but we just want equal opportunity. So looking at some of the conditions that were going on at the time, this is kind of some of the social attitudes that people are trying to change. So, for example, airline stewardesses were fired when you married or reached the age of 32. So that idea of you could only be young and attractive working on an airline, and if you got married, you'd be fired from your job because you were no longer available. If you reach 32, you are now old, so no one would want you, so you'd be fired. Over 1,000 women were dying annually from botched abortions, and then even more than that, we see huge numbers of people who are becoming infertile from botched abortions, or get incredibly sick because it wasn't done well. Right? If you're having abortions in back alleyways, it's much more dangerous and far less sanitary than actually going into a doctor's office and doing all of that. Within the exact same job, women are still paid significantly less than men. And then we also see a lot of issues with harassment at work, rape laws, right? At the time, rape laws said that women must physically resist in order for it to be considered rape. So basically, unless you were covered in bruises and scratches and black eyes and whatever, it wasn't considered a rape. That also means that, if you were passed out, not considered rape, right? If you were sleeping, or if you woke up and were, had found someone breaking into your house, not necessarily considered rape. So if you did not physically resist, legally, it was not considered rape. That also means, marital rape is not a thing and all of that. So we're very much in this element of victim blaming and all of that. And we see very low convictions, which also means people aren't necessarily going to report a whole lot. Additionally, in trials, attorneys were allowed to present evidence of rape victims' previous sexual behavior in order to discredit her testimony. So this is where we're going to get a lot of well, why were you walking alone at night? Why was your skirt so short if you didn't want to have sex? Why were you nice to him earlier in the night? Don't you think he might think that's an invitation? You've slept with people before, so, you probably wanted to do it again, blah, blah, blah. So basically, if you, God forbid, you had ever had sex before, you're probably just a slut, and therefore we're asking for it. So that's sort of the general perception, particularly, and that's, again, a legal argument you can make in a court of law, which is pretty absurd. Yeah. So people are sort of like, this sucks. We're also going to see really high levels of discrimination within, not necessarily of harassment in the workplace, right? So lots of this sort of general idea, particularly left over from the 60s and 70s, of women are just secretaries, and a lot of hotshot people coming in and sort of being like, yeah, she's, flirting or groping or, actual assaults, but lots of harassment across the board without actually taking women seriously at their jobs. They're sort of you're here to be pretty and for me to look at. And so, and then crossing that line of not okay physical contact, right? And that means if you're a woman trying to work, period, right? And that also means if you were married, or if you, if it was your mom working, it's some random person going in and, assaulting or groping them, and if you need that job to survive and you can't quit it, you're put in this really horrible position where it feels like you can't do anything about it. And so, again, all of these issues are sort of these long-standing things that people really are going to start talking about. Okay, so basically, it's in addition to sort of trying to change the societal approach to this, we're also going to see some laws try to be put in place. We will see in August of 1970 a women's strike for equality. This is really the first major feminist demonstration in about half a century, and this is all about trying to pass the ERA, the Equal Rights Amendment, in order to combat wage discrimination. The strike took place on the 50th anniversary of the 19th Amendment, granting women the right to vote, and they were trying to sort of raise awareness that the battle still wasn't won, right? Even though we now have the right to vote, there's still all of these other things going on that are still very problematic. Now, across the board, not all women support this. And this is where we will see Phyllis Schlafly enter the picture. Schlafly is spelled Schlafy. And Schlafly is a woman and an advocate against the women's lib movement. She will say things like, women's lib is a total assault on the role of American mother as wife, or American woman as wife and mother, and the family as a basic unit of society. We'll also see sort of this attitude of feminists do not have a legitimate purpose because there was, quote, no discrimination against women, and so many of them are just so unattractive. And again, this is all Phyllis Schlafly saying this stuff. And very ironically, Phyllis Schlafly, who will be one of the core reasons as to why the ERA does not pass, was a well-educated, professional woman who went around and traveled the country and did not stay home or take care of her family or do any of that. So she's incredibly hypocritical, which of course is, for me, very, very frustrating. All right, we will also see several big advancements. Mary Tyler Moore will star on the first television sitcom concerning a professional woman and centering around a professional woman. We'll see the foundation of Miss Magazine, which will also kind of deal with and talk about women's issues. We see conscious raising groups, and we begin to see legal action taken as well. So class action suits against companies, schools, and businesses who have gender-biased salaries, and advocacy for equal pay and equal employment. The main goal of Women's Lib could be seen as advocating for choice and equality. We start seeing Protestant women challenging the idea that sin is based all on Eve, right? So this idea that all of humanity's issues surround Eve eating the apple first, and more of a push of like, no, this is a multiple thing. Women aren't to blame for all of this. So we see this even like within very religious areas. We see rape and battered women's crisis centers develop, trying to help support women in getting out of really dangerous and really bad marriages, or dealing with, the aftermath of being raped and trying to figure out how to support people. We basically see an overall push for issues that have gone traditionally untouched but are disproportionately affecting women. And we'll see, in order to be involved in this movement, there's a whole variety of different things that you could do to try to change things. But there's this big push of, hey, we make up half the population in America. Like, we would also like to have a say in what goes on around here. We would also not, like to not be treated horribly. So one of the biggest pushes that we start seeing for, like I mentioned before, is the ERA, the Equal Rights Amendment. And the Equal Rights Amendment actually passes through the House of Representatives and the Senate. So it will be passed by Congress in March of 1972. When we are trying to get an amendment ratified, right, you have to go through a series of steps. So first is it has to be passed through Congress. Once it then is sent out to the states to ratify. Now, the reason it does not pass is because it actually does not get the appropriate number of states to ratify the amendment in order for it to go into effect. And a lot of that, again, is due to our dear Miss Phyllis Schlafly. So it doesn't, which is kind of a bummer. It actually has also been reintroduced to Congress every year since 1982, but still has not passed, does not have the necessary number of states. One of the other things that we're going to see passed is something called Title IX of the Higher Education Act. That's also passed in 1972. It forbids gender discrimination in any public university program or activities, so that includes athletics, and this is going to be one of the biggest ramifications, but this opens the door for girls' sports. So if a public school or whatever offers a boys' program in something, then they also have to offer a girls' program in that thing, and vice versa. So if there's something offered for girls and boys want to do it, they also have to open that up for boys. Now, if there's enough girls who want to participate, the easiest example of this is looking at sports, right? So if there's a boys' basketball team and the girls want to have a basketball team, the school has to allow girls to have a basketball team too. If there aren't enough girls who want to participate, the girls have to be then allowed to play, like to practice with the boys if need be. So this opens the door for the possibility of women's athletics. Before, most women's sports that you could play were like, let's, I don't know, play badminton or like croquet. I don't know. But we're starting to see, volleyball becomes the thing. Basketball, soccer, swimming, all of that becomes open to girls as well. We will pass the Equal Employment Opportunity Act also in 1972, and it amends the 1963 Equal Pay Act. This is meant to prohibit sexual discrimination in federally supported programs. So anywhere that the federal government is funding you, it's explicit laws put in place against discriminating based on sex. And finally, in one of the most controversial decisions of the 1970s, but also could argue a very important one, the court case of Roe v. Wade will make it to the Supreme Court and will be decided upon. It all centers around a Texas law that had made abortion a crime, except in the case to save a pregnant woman's life. So that is the law being challenged in the courts. And essentially, when this is decided upon, it legalizes abortion, allowing women to regain control over, or at least make this a legal and open option. Now, obviously, I want to qualify this by saying that abortion is an incredibly sensitive subject. If you truly believe that life begins at the moment of conception, obviously, you're going to have a big aversion to abortion as a whole, because that then means that you're killing babies. And so you're always going to have sort of this push to fight that. But at the same time, if you look, from a little bit more of, I don't know, maybe cold, but objective standpoint of just in terms, women have and always probably will find ways to not carry through with unwanted pregnancies. Also, unwanted pregnancies are horrible for the children themselves because you're oftentimes raised in an environment that isn't good for you and all this other stuff. And then there's so many different sides to these arguments to the, issue of abortion. But ultimately, if we're talking about sort of women's health as a whole, having this be an option is reduces at the very minimum the number of like deaths and illegal abortions and back alley abortions, and increases that sort of safety as an option. So it grants women the right of personal, or it says the right of personal privacy includes the abortion decision, but that right is not unqualified. So this is also really important. It says that states cannot make this a crime, so they can't make it illegal. Every state has to legally allow abortion, but they can regulate it however they want. So it really depends on the state that you're in, but most states will prohibit things like third-term abortions, which babies can live outside of their mother's belly in the third term, so that's can be a good thing, maybe. Again, everyone can have their own opinion, but at the same time, it also will open the door for places like Texas or Mississippi or Alabama, where they have so deeply regulated where and who can offer abortions that there's 2 abortion clinics in the entire state of Texas and 1 in Alabama or Mississippi, which of course, if you are poor or if you're underage or if you don't want, you're a victim of incest, or you don't want your parents to know, or something along those lines, you're going to have a really hard time traveling to that place to get that, because that costs a whole lot of money in order to just make it there. All right. So we also will see clinics that do offer this. So like Planned Parenthood will start to make this an option, but we'll start to see an increase in places that also provide other healthcare and other options as well. Now, just a quick note about Planned Parenthood. They often get a really bad rap because they do provide abortion services. But like 97%, 98% of the services they provide are non-abortion services. More like for the majority, they are a place where women can go to get birth control. And again, birth control prevents abortion either way. So that's one of those things we could talk about too. But access to birth control allows women to not have unwanted pregnancies. And if they don't have unwanted pregnancies, we see the number of abortions decline. And I don't think anyone across the board is advocating for an increase in abortion, right? For both pro-choice and pro-lifers, the goal is not to increase abortions. It's not like we're saying, hey, women, go out there, get pregnant, and then abort the fetus, right? I don't think anyone wants that. I don't think that is a widely accepted idea. It's more like, should it be an option or should it not be an option? But either way, if you can increase access to birth control, you can decrease unwanted pregnancies, which will also then decrease abortions. All right. I'm trying to think. There's so much with this. I mean, it's just fun to talk about, but you don't necessarily need to know. But just know that, this movement does get a little bit controversial by the end, particularly because it doesn't really address rights of women of color or needs of women of color or of anyone of lower socioeconomic status. And like with any movement too, we will see the radicalization of certain parts of it, which then get a lot of criticism as well. As we head into third and arguably fourth wave feminism of the 90s and the 2000s, it's going to change, and there is going to be a lot of different discussions about intersectionality and what it means to like try to address everybody's needs, and also a pushback against that idea of women needing to go out into the world and work. So I think that with second wave feminism, there's also sort of this backlash of like, if you're choosing to stay home and take care of your kids, if you would like to be a housewife, if that is what you want to do, there's a lot of women who are really looked down upon for doing that. And I think part of what, later waves of feminism have also tried to do is address this as more of like, all we want is you to have the option to do whatever you want, not to feel like you have to stay home or you have to go into the workforce. Make a choice. If you want to stay home, that's rad. If you want to go work, that's also rad. Just do what you want to do, have the opportunity to do it. And again, not about women being better than men. And if anyone says that that's what they think, they are not an actual feminist. It's about equality of opportunity, right? Everybody being able to have the same options and same treatment from there. So finally, let's move into the gay and lesbian liberation movement. As we are well aware, being openly gay has not been a very socially acceptable phenomenon in the United States up until this point. And of course, as we can see with places like, many places throughout our country, this can still be a very real issue. So when we talk about the start of this movement, it's really important to understand what the climate was at the time. Homophobia has gone back to the beginnings, deeply rooted back in the beginnings of our country. Virginia is a great example of this. Thomas Jefferson actually will propose legislation when he was the governor of Virginia that would thoroughly liberalize sodomy laws. So I guess before we get into this, sodomy, right, is anal sex, and sodomy laws are often used to target gay men. The idea is that, obviously it's not just gay men who can have anal sex, but with a sodomy law in place, that's who they're trying to prevent from living together. Basically, it's a way to try to regulate being openly gay and prevent you from being openly gay. And so they have been around for years and years and years as a means of shutting down the gay community. So Jefferson actually proposes legislation that would liberalize these, because previously, if you were convicted of sodomy, it would be a mandatory death penalty. So you would be killed on sight. But with the new laws proposed that will make this so much better, you are just merely castrated instead. So rather than, killing you, we're just going to remove some of your nether regions. Has a much nicer approach to this. In the post-World War II era, when we see, the rise of McCarthyism, McCarthy will also do that whole targeting homosexual men as Russian spies, because obviously somehow the Russians have perfect gaydar where they can detect every secretly closeted gay man in America and blackmail them into being a spy, which is, of course, ridiculous. So again, we still see that huge pushback as we get into the 1940s and 1950s. In 1934 as well, Hollywood actually prohibited the depiction of any gay characters or any open discussion of homosexuality on screen. You could not do it. If you were trying to publish a movie or talk about it, you were banned from doing so. And of course, the APA, the American Psychiatric Association, declared that homosexuality was psychopathology. So basically, you have a mental illness if you are gay. And so because of all of that, we basically try to make being gay illegal. Now, obviously, it's a hard... that's a hard thing to do. It's like trying to make, I don't know, whatever. You can't make someone illegal. It's making a person illegal. It doesn't make any sense. But yeah, that's what it was. In 1953, Eisenhower will pass an executive order declaring that homosexuality is a necessary and sufficient reason in itself to fire any federal employee from his job, because again, that association with communism. So if you were found to be gay, you could be fired, and that was sufficient reason to be fired. In most defense industries, and within other government contracts, we'll also see similar programs happen. So like across the board, a lot of people start adopting that sort of policy. And then the U.S. Postal Service will aid in this by putting tracers on anyone, on like the mail of suspected homosexuals, in order to gather enough evidence for dismissal and possible arrest. Homosexuality is illegal in many states through a variety of different methods. Things like prohibiting two men from living together, making it nearly impossible to work, and then, of course, through sodomy laws like we talked about. Up until 1962, sodomy was a felony crime in every state in America. Illinois will become the first state to abolish this law in 1962, and while some other states will follow suit, we actually see a court case in 1986, the case of Bowers versus Hardwick, which reaches the Supreme Court. And the Supreme Court actually upholds the constitutionality of state sodomy laws in Georgia. So it says, yep, Georgia, you can totally have anti-sodomy laws. That's fine. So it's not actually until the case of Lawrence v. Texas in 2003 that the Supreme Court finally overturns this with their ruling that invalidates all remaining sodomy laws in the United States. Again, 2003 is after the attack on 9/11 has happened, after we're involved in Afghanistan, Bush is president, I was alive, I was at PCS. Like, this is recent. I guess relatively so. Maybe I'm just old. But this is recent, right? To this date, Idaho has the harshest, or to that time, sorry, Idaho had the harshest anti-sodomy laws. You would get a life sentence in prison for sodomy up until 2003 when we invalidated those laws finally. So this is the environment that we're working in, right? Which I think is really important to recognize. Like, this is why people are so frustrated. So one of the major moments that we point to as sort of the breaking up moment of the gay and lesbian liberation movement is the Stonewall riots in June of 1969. Now, there is a pretty fun drunk history about this if you feel like looking it up. I was going to show you in class, but if you want to look it up on your own time, totally worth looking at. In New York City, the police will stage a raid in the early morning of June 27th of 1969 at the Stonewall Inn. The Stonewall Inn was a Greenwich Village bar, and its patrons predominantly were gay men, lesbians, trans people, cross-dressers, whatever. And raids on any bar that or any establishment that was considered to be predominantly used by any person in the LGBTQ community were very common. States' laws threatened those bars with loss of liquor licenses if they tolerated same-sex dancing or employed or served men who wore women's clothing, things like that. But part of what makes Stonewall so unique is rather than acquiesce to this raid, which was so regular and happened so frequently, and obviously all of the patrons were treated so freaking terribly, when the cops would come in, the bar's patrons fight back. They battle police with bricks, with bottles, with shards of broken glass. Their 3 days of civil disobedience will follow this, right? So, like, we've talked about civil disobedience, but, purposely breaking laws that you think are unconstitutional and all of that. And so this will become known as the Stonewall riots, these 3 days in the aftermath of this. This is also sort of the moment when the gay community stands up in a big way and, to these police forces that felt so oppressive and so overwhelming. Oops. Hold on. The incident will usher in, sort of the rise of a new push for a new era, right? Where you can be open and active and talk about what's going on with you, and will lead many gay people to come out of the closet and begin publicly asserting their sexual identity, to begin organizing publicly. So in the wake of Stonewall, we will see active organizations like the Gay Liberation Front, and they will transform sexual orientation into a political issue. They will attack customs and laws that defined homosexuality as a sin, a crime, or a mental illness. One of their major victories will come in 1973, when the American Psychiatric Association finally agreed to remove homosexuality from being classified as a psychopathology or mental disorder. So finally it's like, nope, it's normal. But it took until 1973 to do that. So although the emergence of this movement very much caught the general public by surprise, it didn't emerge overnight. We had seen advocacy groups arise in the 1950s opposing laws that prohibited and punished homosexuality. By the late 1960s, gay and lesbian subcultures and communities had grown in many of the nation's cities, complete with bars and cabarets and magazines and restaurants and areas for this community to congregate. And again, sticking together like that was really valuable, because across the board, you see much higher incidences of rapes and beatings and murders of both gay men and women, and of course trans people than within the wider population. So the movement had been growing over decades, but it really comes into the public eye in the late 60s and early 70s. Now, it's also important to remember that with most movements as a whole, we see so many advancements made in the 60s and 70s, but also it still continues to be a real thing. But we're seeing steps taken forward, as we go. In 2011, we repealed Don't Ask, Don't Tell, which essentially banned open homosexuality in the military. So you could not be openly gay, and, if you were, you'd be kicked out. So that'd be grounds for a dishonorable discharge. So we get rid of that, and finally you can be openly gay in the military. But again, we'll also see reactions by passing religious freedom laws, and our vice president currently, Mike Pence, has had a long history of really trying to prevent gay people from hanging out. There's a great John Oliver on Mike Pence, if anyone feels like watching that too, which is pretty entertaining. But this really, we're trying to make this a much more real and much more valued issue in the minds of the American public, and we start to see some major changes in the 60s and 70s. Now we'll come back and talk about both sort of third wave feminism and the continued LGBTQ movement as we get into the 90s after the AP test, but this is really sort of the big focus that you need for the purposes of the AP test. Obviously, I know this doesn't even come close to covering any of, the history of this movement at all, but considering that this is an AP class and you do need certain amounts of information, this is sort of the biggest gist of what you need for the 60s and 70s. All right, guys. Thanks so much. I will see you guys tomorrow and Wednesday. Make sure you have this lecture finished up and the Watergate lecture finished up. I'm going to come around and check them. And then we're going to dive into talking about the 80s and the rise of conservatism. Have a great day.